Why is Brazil so big? This question has been asked a few times. Most videos will talk about the Treaty of Tordesillas and Brazil having been a single colony, rather multiple and stuff like that. But they often ignore one thing. Brazil nearly did break up despite that. What's the story behind that? And which areas would have broken where? Let's dive right in. Brazil in 1835. Quite a chaotic time. Exceptionally so even for Brazilian standard. Brazil is an empire that declared independence from Portugal in 1822. It wasn't yet ruled by the liberal Emperor Pedro II but rather by his father Pedro I. He did approve of the liberal constitution, but he was also a bit arbitrary and impulsive at times. At least Britannica claims so. But things are generally alright. Unless you're a slave, which made up between 45% to half the population. Brazil was the colony, then country in the Americas that imported the most slaves, ahead of the US. Wow, what a horrifying achievement. However, other than slavery, the constitution had one thing that was an issue for many people. Centralization. The constitution created a highly centralized state that resulted in several secession movements. My explanation is that Pedro attempted to build a Brazilian nation, but he was a Portuguese noble after all, actually of the very same dynasty still ruling Portugal, so centralization probably seemed like the right move for him. But of course regional identities and anti-Portuguese sentiments known as Lussophobia were strong, and of course the nearly half the nation that was enslaved wanted to lift themselves off their chains. Maybe do a little ET, at least the elites feared that. One of these before-mentioned secession movements, although not an Afro-Brazilian one, was in Uruguay, which managed to break away in the Cisplatine War from 1825 to 1828, with Argentine help, which also contributed to Pedro abdicating in favor of his 5-year-old son, Pedro II. Merciful gamble to keep the nation stable, Don Pedro. Of course there was a regency and several uprisings. The restorationist Ragarumbling in 1831, which wanted Pedro I back and most importantly the more liberal Cabanagem Pernambuco, Alagoas and Para from 1832 to 1835 she. Okay, enough with her accent. Para even aimed for independence. It was also motivated by Brazil's economy not doing so great, to put it nicely. The year after, Cabanagem broke out in Grand Para, one of the 5 major revolts during the Regency, but there were a lot of revolts, at least 8 more minor ones. Western Crusader King's civil wars after succession. I need to stop overextending. And of course also the war that is in the title of this video, the Ragamuffin War, also known as the Rupia Revolt, which I probably mispronounced. It was the largest one of the 5 revolts, but not the bloodiest by a long shot. Or I accidentally typed long shit in my script, oops. Sadly, there's barely any info on the other 3 major ones, so I'll just talk about them chronologically while talking about the Ragamuffin and Cabanagem War. The first revolt of the year 1835 was the Malê Revolt. The Malays, from Yoruba Imale, meaning Yoruba Muslim, were Muslims in Bahia, most of which were slaves. In January 1835, during Ramadan, some of them rose up. It was a planned uprising, not a spontaneous one, although it took place earlier than planned. There were more than 600 rebels. But they were quickly crushed, and due to fears of Bahia turning into ET, the authorities executed 4 rebels, sentenced 16 to prison, 8 to forced labor, but isn't that just sentencing a slave to be a slave, and 45 to be flogged. In the end, around 100 people died, 7 government forces and around 85 rebels. And that doesn't round up to 100 because I said around, listen better. The next one was the Cabanagem, which began with the back then modest town of Billing, which had 12,000 inhabitants, most of which were white or Italian. And, as you can hear, I took 2 months of Portuguese on Duolingo before. Practicamente affirmativo, ¿sabes? And after that joke we can say that the music no longer fits. It was nice for the transition, but I think I'm gonna switch up the music. Anyway, it had 2 causes. On the one hand, the common folks were suffering from extreme poverty. On the other hand, the elites didn't like Brazil's centralism, which favored the south. They also had a historical reason to want more autonomy. Grand Para, like other northern states, was actually a separate state within the Portuguese Empire from Brazil, which the videos on why Brazil is so big usually neglect. I can't blame them. This is barely if ever mentioned, and all 3 states were merged in 1775. Maybe it was 1823. English Wikipedia and World Atlas say in 1785 all colonies were merged, but the Portuguese article on the state of Grand Para e Rio Negro says 1823. Rio Negro.
He said the N-word!
I give up. I even asked Ciplix, who was Brazilian but he was classed as confused. But it doesn't matter. At some point it was a separate entity, that's all that matters. I wonder if this is even 1% of what secretly Gray felt like researching Tiffany. And probably not even 0.1%. But yeah, both were the motives for the Cabanaging. As mentioned, it began in Brail when rebels took over the city on January 6, 1835 and executed the governor, Bernardo Lourdes Souza, who had repressed any opposition in the prior years, often arbitrarily. Yeah, you could say he was kinda sus. Amogus in the big 2025. Someone showed me. Back to the rebellion, the city also had a lot of ammunition, useful for rebellion of course, unless your enemy claims to be immune to bullets. I can't believe that happened both in China and Tanzania. The rebels made a farmer, his name was German, so I must say in German despite it being Brazilian Portuguese, Felix Clemente Antonio Malta, president, and the rebels, not Malta, aimed to achieve independence for Grão-Pará. But Malta tried to keep unity with Brazil in an attempt to appease the upper class, which the other rebels took a mild issue with, so assassinated his ass and dragged his body through the streets of Berlin. Reasonable reaction, I'd say. The new president, Francisco Vinagre, Vinagre, nearly surrendered to the government knowing the rebellion was weak, but his brother swayed him to continue the fight. Probably for the better of him, considering what they did to the last guy. Although, it would have saved all the people about to die in the rebellion. The rebels were pretty much destroyed by the imperial government, but made a comeback and retook the city after regrouping in the interior of Grão-Pará and basically took over the province Viet Cong style. So yeah, a lot happened in 1835. Eduardo and Lelim assumed the presidency but had no plan to consolidate the rebel government, resulting in the rebellion being weak. In March 1836, the brigadier Francisco José, not José, de Souza Soares de Andrea was made president of the province by pro-Brazilian force and enacted the policy of total war with rebels by carpet bombing Cambodia. Well, that's not right. He attacked Berlin, the capital, which made the rebels abandon the city and fight from the interior of Grão-Pará. Again. Angeline, however, was captured trying to flee the city and then detained. Some say this is the end of that conflict, but actually continued for another 3 years until a general amnesty was issued in 1839, and in 1840 the last rebel group surrendered. It's estimated that 40% of the 1,500 people living in Pará died during the revolt. I'm sorry, Martin, for ever doubting you and your attempt to keep unity with Brazil. I'm sorry. A rebellion that lasted even longer was the Ragamuffin War. Which also started in 1835 in the southernmost province of Rio Grande do Sul. Just like Yankee Doodle, the term Ragamuffin or Tahapu was an insult at first, but the rebels adopted the term with pride. Ragamuffin basically means a person wearing rags. I can't pronounce R, sorry. Okay, enough lightheartedness. Back to fun stuff like war and thousands of people dying. The Ragamuffins wanted to establish a republic and abolish slavery. Abolishing slavery is objectively based, no matter whether the slaves were prisoners of war or regular prisoners. Good thing no country today would employ slave labor in the prison system and no other countries would take away the passports for migrant workers and trap them in the country. Yeah, I finally respect different opinions and be neutral in my videos. Sure, I want people to be free individuals, you want them to be property, surely we can find a compromise. It's your culture after all, I gotta respect that. Now back to the Ragamuffins. They were abolitionist Republicans. The main motive of the uprising were economical hardships, above all in the cattle industry, due to Argentina and Uruguayan competition. The revolt broke out on September 20, 1845 under the leadership of Bento Gonçalves. Guess his last name? Correct? Da Silva. The quickly carried the capital of Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre, but lost it again in Leona for next year. In September, the rebels met in Piratini, declared the independence of the Rio Grande Republic, acting Bento Gonçalves da Silva as president. Although, the republic is often called the Piratini Republic instead of a River Big Dense Republic. The rebels actually had a lot of success. Among other things, thanks to a little known later to be Italian revolutionary known as Giuseppe Garibaldi joining them. Thanks to this, the revolution managed to spread to Santa Catarina, but that wasn't the only factor. The caudillo president of Uruguay, José Fructuoso Rivera, a very fruity individual, that wanted to establish a greater Uruguay, including Rio Grande do Sul and parts of Argentina, also began aiding the rebels militarily and financially. And the participation of Afro-Brazilians was also crucial to the rebellion. Around 25% of the rebel forces were Afro-Brazilians by the end of the war. They were promised freedom, which was a promise sure to be kept. No, the success of the Ragamuffins inspired the Sabinera revolt in Bahia from 1837 to 1838, which called for the abolition of slavery and redistribution of land. Very based. Bahia was crushed in 1838. Back to the Ragamuffins, following expedition across Rio Grande's northern border, a second republic was declared in Santa Catarina. A free and independent Catarinense republic. Also could have added a sovereign or most sovereign at that point, but okay. It's also commonly called the Juliana Republic. That one fell only 4 months later though. The Alibadi really had a thing for assisting doomed republics. In 1814, the Brazilian government offered the rebels amnesty in exchange for laying down their arms, but they refused. Remember, the Afro-Brazilians, such an amnesty wouldn't include their freedom. They would have been forced to become slaves again. In 1842, the revolutionaries issued a constitution and more votes were on Minas Gerais or something like that, and São Paulo, but those were unsuccessful. In 1844, a racist massacre took place, the Porongos Massacre. On November 14, 1844, the Imperial Cavalry unit launched a pre-dawn attack on a Ragamuffin encampment. More than 100 were killed, and several hundred more taken prisoner. Nearly all of the victims were Afro-Brazilian. The separate camps for white and indigenous soldiers on the other side of a small creek were left alone by the Imperial Cavalry. Why? According to this article, Forgotten Betrayal of Southern Brazil's Black Revolutionaries by Andrew Jenner, Afro-Brazilians could not go free. What is the quickest way to make sure they can't go free? Massacring them. Sadly, the participation of Afro-Brazilians in the Ragamuffin War is ignored to this very day. The Afro-Brazilian Ragamuffins are not mentioned in the classrooms and ignored in the annual celebration of the revolution every September, at least according to the article. If you live in Rio Grande do Sul or Santa Catarina, comment that below if this video somehow reaches you. Now, how did the rebellion end? On March 1st, 1845, a peace treaty was finally concluded, the Green Poncho Treaty. In exchange for the rebels stopping the fight, the Brazilian government promised that the officials would all subscribe to this channel, and like 98% of my viewers which aren't subscribed. Share yourself plagicide. Let's ask. Fellow history YouTuber, Red Slime explains. Red Slime, what did the treaty say?
Well, the treaty offered full amnesty to the rebels, and the debt of the Rio Grande Republic was to be paid off by the imperial government. Additionally, a 25% on charque was introduced. Charque, essentially South American jerky, had been one of the main causes of the rebellion due to competition from Uruguay and Argentina. The rebels were also incorporated into the imperial army and were given the right to choose the next provincial president.
Alright, thanks for explaining. Check him out, he makes some phenomenal videos. His videos are definitely better than me copying Chessed Gamon. So yeah, basically around 3,000 people died for terrorists on beef jerky. Okay, Brazil began to actually become a unified nation. Well, that was it. Thank you for watching us here. What do you think about the rebels? He was fighting for equality and the abolition of slavery. People with a good idea that however never had a chance and thus spilled thousands of liters of blood over nothing. Or maybe you're a white supremacist that thinks that they were traitors that destabilized the nation and paved the way for a corrupt later to be a republic over something minor like literally half a country being enslaved.